We are going to finish the FBR lecture today. Your test is Wednesday. I just faxed over to your proctors the test, so they should have it today for you on Wednesday to get you ready for it. I haven't heard from anybody, so I hope y'all haven't had any questions. Nobody's sent me any emails or texts or anything asking anything. Usually I get bombarded the week before the test. So either that means I'm a master teacher and you've all learned it all, or more likely you haven't bothered looking at the study guide yet. If you haven't bothered looking at the study guide yet, you are way behind. So you got a day. You need to make sure you do well on this test. All right. Let's talk about the battle for France. We are right in the midst of World War II. And again, when we left off, we had switched to a world history class for a little while so we could understand what was going on. In France, they had, Nazis had invaded into France. They had used blitzkrieg to do this. Blitzkrieg literally means lightning war. And what that means is they realized that it wasn't important to conquer all of France. What was important was to conquer the Ile-de-France, Paris, the island of France, the center part. So they came in with their tanks, and these tanks were, they're pretty high speed. These tanks can go about 60 miles an hour. And they came in down the Autobahn, connected into France, rode all the way in, captured Paris, and they just skipped all those small towns on the way through. And once they hit Paris, they end up stealing their own government there, and they push out and conquer from there. As a result of that, there were two French governments. There was Free France, which was led by Charles de Gaulle, General Charles de Gaulle, who was actually living in London at the time because that's the only place he could be safe. And Vichy France, which was led by Marshal Pétain, which was the Nazi puppet government in Paris. If you've ever seen the movie Casablanca, the lead police officer in that is a Vichy France police officer. You want to get some kind of an idea of what it was like. They were a puppet government for the Nazis. So you had this issue in France of which government is legitimate, okay? In Britain, they had a different problem. They weren't able to use the same strategies they've used in all the other countries. For instance, blitzkrieg will not work in invading Britain because tanks cannot swim across the English Channel, okay? So instead, they used the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and they bombed Britain into the Stone Age, particularly London. By this point, Neville Chamberlain has been removed as Prime Minister, and this gentleman, Winston Churchill, has been made Prime Minister of England. He's returned to power. He had been Prime Minister before Neville Chamberlain. Now he's brought back. He's very much an anti-Nazi, anti-communist, didn't really like Joe Stalin, although he works with him in World War II. And he puts these radio broadcasts out where you hear him, and he put this sense of security in the British people, where you hear, this is Winston Churchill live from London, and you hear the bombs bursting in the background. And the fact that Churchill was there with you made the people of Britain they said they took it with a stiff upper lip. What that means is they didn't let the bombings destroy them. While their city was destroyed, they were continuing about their business. Now we find out later that this was all a lie, that Churchill wasn't in fact in Berlin. He was in a recording studio in the United States during most of this time, recording these, and it was being broadcast out. But we didn't really know that at the time. So America is neutral during the start of this war, 1937, 1938. We are staying out of it because we were afraid of getting dragged into another war. World War I just wasn't that long ago. It ended in 1918. So we had passed these Neutrality Acts. The problem is the Neutrality Acts were seen by this point as being too inflexible. What the Neutrality Act said was that it was illegal for the United States to trade with any nation that is involved in a war. It did not distinguish between aggressor states and victim states. It didn't even allow us to trade with nations that were being victimized by others. So in October of 1937, FDR gives his famous quarantine speech, where he calls for quarantining evil. Now, what he means by that is that these aggressive nations, particularly France, Italy, and Japan, that were seeking to conquer their neighbors, that we needed to stop them. We needed to stop their spread. Now, at this point, he's not saying we need to go to war and conquer them, but we need to prevent them from expanding any further, quarantining them. And the way he calls about this is through a program called Lend-Lease, where we would lend weapons to these states, these victim states, and in exchange they would lease us land to build military bases. Okay? 1939, 1940, the foreign policy debate is starting to push us towards war. We're getting closer. There are people that don't like it. There's a committee called the America First Committee that was very much about staying neutral. It was led by guys like Charles Lindbergh and Father Coughlin that we've seen before. Charles Lindbergh, actually America's most famous hero at this time after making the transatlantic flight in the 1920s. Charles Lindbergh actually goes to Germany, meets with Adolf Hitler, and inspects the German Air Force, where he is awarded with the German Cross. That's the picture at the bottom. Hitler gave Charles Lindbergh the German Cross, which is the highest award that a civilian can get in Germany. Lindbergh came back and said that his Air Force is too powerful, it's too large, we should never fight Germany. There's no way we can defeat them. He's preaching America first. Coughlin was that big radio show host that had gone against Roosevelt during the second New Deal. In the spring of 1940, America was completely unprepared to go to war. We had about 350 tanks in the whole country. That's less tanks than Germany had in Paris, okay? We had 350 tanks, period. We had almost no planes, and our soldiers had been sent home after World War I. Our army was at pre-World War I strength, okay? We were not large at all. If we would have had to go to war in 1940, we couldn't have fought. What we had was an economic machine, not a military machine. So what do? I've already talked about Lend-Lease. I'm going to go into summer of 1940 when the Burke-Wadsworth Bill is passed. The Burke-Wadsworth Bill is super important in history, and if you are a political guy of the libertarian mindset, the Burke-Wadsworth Bill is one that you absolutely hate. It was the very first peacetime draft in American history. We began drafting people into the military, and we were not at war with anybody. We had not declared war on anyone. Now, what does that tell you? If the president and Congress decide to start drafting people into war, and you're not, into the military, and you're not at war, what should you immediately know? You are about to go to war, and they know you are. That was in 1940. So if anybody tells you that we were not planning on going to war until Pearl Harbor happened in 1941, they are lying to you. They are flat out lying to you. Because if we weren't prepared to go to war, why were we increasing the size of the army in 1940? Okay? There was a committee called, we're just going to call it the White Committee. It was technically called the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies, but it was led by William Allen White, a Republican congressman. So we give it his name, the White Committee. And its purpose was that the U.S., while we shouldn't declare war, we should start funneling money and guns and bullets to the Allied powers to try and stop the Axis. So we're already getting there. We're still not at war, but it's 1940, and Roosevelt runs for a third term as president. Shocking the world. No president had ever sought a third term. Ulysses S. Grant wanted to seek a third term, but he couldn't get the nomination of his party. No president had ever done it. Theodore Roosevelt wanted a third term, but he couldn't do it. He tried to do it in a third party, and he lost his election. So what do? We have FDR and Henry Wallace, and they're running against Wendell Willkie, possibly the worst name for any presidential candidate in history, with the worst campaign slogan. Wendell Willkie's campaign slogan was, "We want Willkie," which sounds just remotely dirty. So it's not probably not a very good campaign slogan there. FDR takes him so lightly, so unseriously, that he jokingly says that my campaign slogan will be "better a third term than a third-rate," basically calling Willkie a third-rate candidate. He realizes that this guy is not a serious threat to him. And he wins in a landslide. FDR wins 449 to 82. FDR wins all the blue states. Pretty big victory. Now 1941. America is inching closer to war, but we need something to trigger it. Okay? And we get it on December 7th, 1941. Without a declaration of war, the Imperial Army of Japan attacked U.S. naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Early morning hours on a Sunday. We were not prepared. There's a reason why they attacked us. Pearl Harbor is the only place that America can put force into the Pacific from. If they can cripple our base at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy has no power in the Pacific, and it leaves Japan as the sole power. So they made a sneak attack. They were pretty effective. They found our planes lined up in nice, neat lines. They strafed them. They blew it up. They destroyed most of our fleet. However, they made one tactical error. We had sent a small contingent of our ships out on maneuvers a couple of days earlier, and they were not in port. They were out at sea doing maneuvers, and they were saved from the destruction. So it does not completely cripple us. Instead, it pisses us off. Okay? And Tojo realized immediately the mistake. Tojo is quoted, now sometimes it's said Tojo, sometimes it's said Hitler said it, but it's usually credited to Tojo, that we have awakened the sleeping giant. When they attacked the United States, suddenly we had our excuse to go to war. Now I want to talk about the elephant in the room when you talk about Pearl Harbor. There are people out there that suggest that Franklin Roosevelt knew Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked, and he allowed it to be attacked in order to get us into war. I would say that the evidence for that is very, very slim. Okay? Here's the evidence they have. The U.S. Army spotted the Japanese Navy steaming towards Pearl Harbor a few hundred miles away, days before it reached there. The U.S. Navy sent a message to warn Pearl Harbor that they were headed in that direction. That message made it to San Diego, and at the message center in San Diego, it made it to Washington, D.C., but then the message center in D.C. never sent it back to Hawaii. This has led people to say that the president intervened in D.C. and he said, I know about it, but we're not telling Pearl Harbor because we want them to be attacked. I'm an old Marine. I was a Marine back in the days when messages were still sent that way through comm centers instead of, internet like it is today. And messages got lost all the time. This is not something that surprises me at all. The military is not good at getting messages to people. I think the standard of proof is just way too high to accuse the president of intentionally allowing Americans to die. When in reality, all he would have had to do is tell the American people the Japanese had been seen steaming towards Pearl Harbor. This in itself is an act of war. We're attacking, and we would have gotten into it and not had to lose American lives. Okay? So I think the evidence for it is slim at best. But it is a possibility that he allowed it. There are historians that believe he allowed it. So I at least wanted to address it. All right, so we're now in. What are we going to do once we declare war? We declare war the very next day, by the way, on Japan, and Germany then declares war on us. Well, one of the things we do is, and to me this is the low point for American history, the President issues Executive Order 9066. This is actually requested by the Attorney General of California. Executive Order 9066 creates what they call military zones, where we interned, first it was just Japanese Americans. We took Japanese Americans that were legally here, and in most cases legally citizens, sometimes second, third, and fourth generation citizens on the West Coast, and we interned them in camps. We took them from their homes, we put them behind barbed wire in military camps because we were worried that they were spies. Now, it wasn't just Japanese. Here in Texas, we had German camps. In Kennedy, Texas, my great, I think it was one great-grandfather worked in an internment camp in Kennedy, Texas, where Germans were taken out of the hill country and put there. Italian Americans up in New York were done, although in the German and the Italian cases, they were almost always immigrants. They weren't second and third generation people. What we did to the Japanese was blatantly racist and un-American. By the way, Japanese Americans actually volunteered for the military at a higher rate than other native-born Americans did. So they were very patriotic, and we still lock these people up, okay? It's a very, very sad thing. That was Executive Order 9066. Some of these Japanese Americans sued, and they claimed under the 14th Amendment, where the 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized are citizens of the United States and have all the rights of citizenship. They argued that we are citizens and we cannot be treated differently. By the way, they were right. They shouldn't have been treated differently. They argued the case. It went to the Supreme Court, and the court at that time, led by Chief Justice Hugo Black, said that the need to protect the United States against espionage, that means spying, was greater and more important than the need to protect the rights of citizenship, and that it was okay to lock Americans up. Absolutely disgusting. I have no respect for Hugo Black after that decision. So Korematsu versus U.S. Korematsu lost. What else were we doing to get ready for the war? Well, we needed to get our minorities to join the military in large numbers. And one of the ways we did it is we founded the Tuskegee Institute. Well, it had been around for a while, but we converted the Tuskegee Institute into a military training facility where we trained pilots. These guys were called the Red Tails, and it was a elite unit of African American pilots, the Tuskegee Airmen, or the Red Tails. They ended up being very effective fighters during World War II. I kind of like them. Things were not looking good. And then Hitler made a fatal error. On June 22nd, 1941, he broke the agreement that he had made with the Soviets. Remember the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where he told the Soviets, I won't attack you if you don't attack me? And they'd agreed to leave each other alone? Well, he broke that truce. And he opens up a two-front war. Now, Germany's fighting a war in the West against England, France, and the U.S., and in the East against Russia. So they have to push out from both directions. this is a dumb decision. To give you an idea, Germany is smaller than the size of Texas. This would be like if Texas declared war on the United States and Mexico. It would be a dumb decision, okay? Well, that's what Germany did here under Hitler. Opening up a two-front war, that means they have to split their forces, and they're surrounded. This is when Germany doomed itself to lose the war. Finally, in 1944, we invade at Normandy Beach. The U.S. actually wasn't involved a whole lot in the war in Europe. We were mostly in the Pacific. We let England and France do most of the fighting in Europe. But on June 6, 1944, we land at Normandy Beach. By the way, this was one of the greatest military hustles of all time. We needed to fool the Germans. And there have been so many invasions between England and France. The places everybody invades is either at Calais or Normandy. The rest of the beaches are too hard to get on. And they want to invade at Normandy, but they need to convince the Germans that they're invading at Calais. So what did they do? Well, they found this homeless guy that had died in London. And that needed to be an Englishman because they needed to have the dental work that looks British and all this stuff so they could fool the Germans. They found this homeless guy. They dressed him up in English Air Force uniform. They created a fake identity for him with papers, and they handcuffed a briefcase to him with plans in it that said that the British were planning on invading at Calais. And they took him up in a plane, and they flew the plane and wrecked the plane behind enemy lines where the Germans were in charge. So the Germans find it, they find the body, and they believe they have found a messenger from the English government. When in fact it was just a dead body that the British had put there to trick them. That convinces the Germans that the Americans and the British are going to land at Calais, and they move their forces down the beach considerably further, leaving just a skeleton group left at Normandy Beach. And on June 6th, we invaded at Normandy Beach. Pretty smart move. By the end of August 1944, we're able to push through and we liberate all of France. Okay? France falls. This next picture is a little disturbing, and I apologize for it, but I think it's important for us to see. Let's talk about Italy a little bit. I told you once before that I put Italy up there as an Axis power with a question mark. And I told you it's a question mark because Italy is unique in history as never losing a war because they always change sides. Well, that's what happens here. Italy sees the writing on the wall. The Americans have come back through France, and now they're moving down through Italy. And instead of fighting the Americans, the Italians decide it's better to be on the American side. So the people rose up and they overthrew Mussolini, their own leader. They went up in the hotel that Mussolini and his mistress were in, and they pulled Mussolini and his mistress out, hung them by their feet, and beat them to death in the streets. That is Mussolini hanging there. So when the Americans showed up, the Italians cheered the Americans and went, "We're on your side. See, we killed the bad guy ourselves." And sure enough, we accepted them, and the Italians joined the fight against Hitler on our side at this point. That's kind of one of the things that they're known for. So if we didn't have a lot to do with the European war, what did we have a lot to do with? We had a great deal to do with the war in the Pacific. The Pacific creates a big problem. The issue there is Japan is a series of islands, and islands are very hard to conquer, extremely hard to conquer. And the area is so spread out that our planes could not reach. You can't take off from Hawaii and reach Japan. You couldn't back then, at least. So we have to get creative. And we came up with two ideas. The first was we built aircraft carriers. Nobody had ever seen these on a large scale. And we started taking bombers off from aircraft carriers. But the second thing that we did is we created island hopping. What this is where we conquer an island at the outskirts. After we conquer the island, we build a runway, we land planes on it, and we use that as a hopping point to go to the next island that we can get to. We hop to that island, we do the same thing. We conquer it, we build a runway, and then we hop to the next island. It's just a series of island hops as you get closer and closer to Japan. And the big islands are listed here in the order that we got them. And just by luck, it lends itself to an acrostic. You can see it there. Bigot, B-I-G-O-T, is how you can remember it if you needed to. Bougainville, Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, Okinawa, and Tarawa. The two that you're familiar with, these won't be on your STAR test, and they won't be anything big, but I think we at least need to talk about two of these. Iwo Jima. You're all familiar with that one, right? You've all seen the picture of the Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi. The five guys, and they're holding that big flag up, raising it. That's at Iwo Jima. That was the single bloodiest battle in World War II until Tarawa. Now, Tarawa was up there right on the verge of being in Japan. And Tarawa it's a rough spot. You want to know why Marines and sailors don't get along? Tarawa is why. The Navy provides the transportation for the Marines, and they had loaded their ships up, and the plan was they're going to land the Marines on Tarawa, and the Marines would rush in, they would secure the beach, and then they would resupply them. Well, the problem is they didn't combat load the ships. When you combat load a ship, you load it in the order that you want things to come off. So the last things you put on are the first things you'll need. That's not how they loaded it. They just loaded it like you would load the back of your car if you're moving. However it fits best, which makes it very hard to get your goods. So time came to get the Marines off, and all the Marines had was 2 magazines worth of ammunition, 2 canteens of water, and a day's worth of food. They get off the ship, they land, and they land to intense fire from the Japanese. And planes start coming, and the admiral, a guy named Bull Halsey, chooses to protect his fleet over protecting the Marines. And he says, we can't resupply them. And to protect the ships, he leaves. And he abandons these Marines on Tarawa with 2 magazines, 2 canteens of water, and 1 day's worth of food, and just left. When the president finds out about this, the president removes Bull Halsey, fires him, brings in a guy named Chester Nimitz, a Texan, by the way. Chester Nimitz hears this and says, we don't leave our men behind. And he showed back up. It's 6 weeks later when he shows back up at Tarawa. The Marines have had no contact with anybody. They've just been written off. They're expected to all be dead. When they get there, they find that the Marines have captured Tarawa. But they've captured it at a 90% death rate. 90% of the ones dropped off are dead. And the only reason they were able to capture it was because their very first action was they took all the Marines they had and they captured a Japanese armory. And then they used Japanese weapons and guns to capture the rest of the island. That becomes the bloodiest battle in the history of the United States. Okay, Tarawa, very, very bloody. 90% death rate. But this is how it is. It's very expensive in terms of lives to conquer an island. What else do we do? Well, we have this group called the Flying Tigers. They were around in 1941 and 42. The Flying Tigers was technically called the American Volunteer Group. They were technically volunteers in the Chinese Air Force. But it turns out these volunteers were Air Force pilots and Navy pilots and Marine pilots who were flying. They were really mercenaries. They were flying under the control of this guy, Claire Chennault. If you've ever seen the movie Flying Tigers or the TV series Black Sheep Squadron. That's what this is about. Yeah.
I feel like, okay, I went to this plane hangar museum in Florida, Pensacola.
Yeah.
I feel like I've seen one there.
Yeah, you have. You have. There's some there.
Okay.
That's what that is. And they would paint them this way for dogfights. These were the most feared pilots that the Japanese had ever seen. It was a big deal because the Chinese had never been able to stop the Japanese. And all of a sudden, Chinese Air Force was defeating the Japanese, and nobody could figure out why. Well, the reason why was because they were flying Chinese planes, but it was American pilots, highly trained American pilots that were doing it. Pretty talented guys. The Battle of Midway, it's part of this island hopping system, pretty important. Midway is going to be absolutely essential to control, and we all know why Midway is essential. We've already talked about it. It's midway between the United States and China. It's whoever controls Midway controls the refueling station. America was able to beat back a Japanese attack here, although at great cost. What else is happening? In the Philippines, where part of the war is happening, Japan has conquered the Philippines, and in fact, during World War II is the first time since the American Revolution that an American military surrendered to a foreign military. And we are ordered, the U.S. Marines are ordered to surrender to Japan rather than fight because they are so outnumbered at Korematsu. And the men that were captured were put in prisoner of war camps, and they were marched. We call this the Bataan Death March. 60,000 to 80,000 Filipino and American prisoners of war. The death rate was over 75%. This is an actual photograph of these prisoners of war as they were starved. My grandfather was on this Bataan Death March. He survived, but he dies very, very young. He dies at 45 years old from problems related to this. So American prisoners of war were treated terrible. And when we saw this just inspires Americans more and more to fight. This is what we were fighting against. Okay? Now, we had internment camps for the Japanese, but we didn't have death camps. This is a death camp. Okay? 1944 comes along, we have another election, and lo and behold, Franklin Roosevelt decides to run for election again, a fourth term. But he's worried about a vice presidential candidate getting too strong. He doesn't like the challenger, so he drops his VP and he picks this guy from Missouri, Harry Truman, or Harry S. Truman. By the way, you'll notice there's no period after the S. That's because it doesn't stand for anything. His middle name was actually S. It's not abbreviated. Harry S. Truman, he actually wasn't given a middle name by his parents, but when he ran for office, he decided that Harry Truman didn't sound smart enough, so he legally added the letter S to his name to make himself sound more educated. He became Harry S. Truman. Harry Truman is so, I mean, he's popular. He's been a World War II guy, but he's not really seen as a smart guy. He's just kind of non-threatening. So people accepted him. They jokingly, he was from Missouri, they jokingly called him the second Missouri Compromise. Everybody would accept him, okay? And again, Roosevelt picked him because he wasn't a threat to him. He wasn't charismatic. He wasn't likable. He was just Harry, nobody special. And he runs against this guy, Thomas Dewey, who looks strangely like Tony Stark's dad in every Captain America movie. But Thomas Dewey was a wealthy person that was expected to do well against Franklin Roosevelt. He doesn't. He loses 432 to 99, and Roosevelt wins his fourth term as president. Now, guys, is Roosevelt starting to look more like a king than a president at this point? Yeah. And everybody sees it. They're worried about it.
16 years.
Yeah, he doesn't make it that long because he dies shortly into his 4th term.
My mom told me the other day she likes the idea of monarchy.
Hey, monarchy's okay as long as I'm the monarch. Otherwise, it's not so good. April 12th, 1945. See, Roosevelt hadn't been in power very long at all in his 4th term. And he dies in Warm Springs, Georgia.
How old was he?
He wasn't that old because he was in his 40s when he was elected. So he really wasn't that old. He looked old because he had polio. And this means that Harry Truman is going to be raised to the office of the president. We have never had a president raised to the office more ill-prepared. Roosevelt had told him nothing. Roosevelt had only met with the vice president once since he had been elected. He had only been in one meeting. The vice president was kept out of everything. And now he's the president, he's unprepared, and he has to deal with this war. Imagine being in his place. So what do? Well, the war is almost over. On April 25th, 1945, the Americans and the Soviet armies met in Berlin. There's a great picture of them shaking hands. They've conquered Germany. A few days later, Adolf Hitler commits suicide. You notice I have 2 dates up here. It's because the French papers said that he committed suicide on April 30th. The Russian papers said it was May 2nd. We don't know, but Hitler's body is found in his bunker in Berlin. And he didn't just commit suicide. He and his wife, Eva Braun, they had poisoned themselves with arsenic, and then he had shot Eva Braun and shot himself.
Jeez.
He wants to make sure that he's not captured, because imagine what the Russians would have done to him if they would have captured him.
Didn't they inject like their Jews and stuff with the poison?
They did lots of experimenting on the Jews. We're going to find out all that stuff here in a little while whenever they finally see the camps.
I just remember.
But on May 8th, 1945, Germany officially surrenders. We call this VE Day, Victory in Europe. So Hitler surrendered. That does not mean the war's over, but Italy's out of it, Germany's out of it, Japan is still in the war. At this point, we learn the truth about the Holocaust. We see the death camps. And we knew there were camps, but we did not understand what was going on with the Holocaust. We didn't understand that they had death factories, where they were marching these Jews into these rooms, telling them that they were getting showers, handing them soap and a towel. You're going to get a shower now. And they would go in, and Xylon gas would come off, kill them all, and they would burn the bodies. Now, here's the deal. The ovens were designed to burn at low temperatures, low enough that the bodies would burn up and decay, but the gold and the silver fillings wouldn't. So they could then go through the ashes and collect the gold and silver out of the bodies.
Oh my God.
It's a very disturbing thing they found. General Eisenhower orders his army reporters to take pictures. And I love this because he says, they ask him, why do you want pictures of this? And he says this, turns out he's right. He says, we must record this or some damned fool will one day deny the Holocaust ever happened. And lo and behold, what's going on today? There are idiots out there that claim the Holocaust was a hoax. There are people that believe the Holocaust never happened. You know, I've got a lot of respect for a lot of different views, but if you're a Holocaust denier, you're an idiot. Okay?
How do people just come up with all these freaking documents and stuff? Or, no.
Here's kind of some information about it. We know that Hitler's party, along with its collaborators, systematically murdered somewhere around 6 million Jews. Now, it's not just Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, blacks. They were trying to purge the world of anybody that was not Aryan. Now here's the great irony. Turns out that the German people aren't actually Aryan, but Hitler didn't understand that. But I never have understood it. How charismatic must this guy have been? He told the people that the superior race are blonde hair, blue-eyed Germans over 6 feet tall. And he was brown hair, brown-eyed, Austrian. His grandfather was probably Jewish, by the way, and he wasn't 6 foot tall, but he's their leader. That amazes me, and people followed him. Sad.
Don't most Jews have brown eyes?
I don't know. Let's talk about Japan's surrender and get to the end of this movement. Germany surrendered, Japan is not at this point. His military advisors come to President Truman and they say, we have this weapon. We've experimented with it. It's the most powerful weapon the world has ever seen. And if we drop it, we're going to kill a bunch of people, but we can end the war quickly. It's the atomic bomb. Now, there's some evidence that we did not understand how powerful it was, but it is the most powerful weapon the world has ever seen. And they tell Truman gets attacked a lot for doing this, because we've remained to this day the only country in the world that's ever dropped the atomic bomb. And we did it twice in 3 days.
Batman and Little Boy, right?
Yep. But his advisors tell him, and most historians agree today, that the cost of invading the Japanese mainland will cost not only more American lives than dropping the bomb, but will in fact cost more Japanese lives, because they will fight to the last man if you invade their land. Instead, we should drop this weapon and force them to surrender. And on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay flies in and drops the very first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Hiroshima is an industrial powerhouse. It's where they make their military weapons.
That's smart.
And we flattened it. We didn't just flatten it. We flattened all the buildings for a 3-mile radius. For a 7-mile radius, we killed everything in sight. And for a 14-mile radius, there was a radiation cloud that poisoned whatever was surviving. Nobody's ever seen anything like this. That picture at the top left was taken from the Enola Gay as it was leaving. So that's actually a photo of the atomic bomb blowing up at Hiroshima. When Japan did not immediately surrender, 3 days later on August 9th, we dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki. This is Little Boy. Batman was the first one, Little Boy's the second. Japan surrenders on August 14th. Aboard the USS Missouri, they surrender to General of the Army Douglas MacArthur. And this is VJ Day, Victory in Japan. World War II is over. Our troops returned, and they returned as heroes with a great welcome. Ticker tape parades everywhere. And I put this picture up here because this has long been one of my favorite pictures. I have this hanging up in my house, my office. I love this picture, and I've always thought it was awesome. But it wasn't until just a few years ago that I learned the real story about this. I always thought this was a picture that symbolized hope. And you had this American soldier that came home, and he's been gone for a long time, and he sees his girl, and he bends her over, and he gives her this kiss, and it's this hopeful picture. Turns out that's not at all what happened. This guy was drunk, and he was running around kissing all the women. This is one of many pictures that was taken of him. This is just the one that became most famous. But I still love the picture, and it kind of shows it still shows hopefulness to me. All right, that gets us through World War II. Wednesday we have an exam. The next week we have we pick up with the Cold War, and we're going to push on through and finish the class. Our last test will, as always, be a take-home test. So kind of be ready for it with that stuff. But that's just kind of how things work. Okay. If you need anything, remember you can text me, you can email me, you can even call me. I will respond, but it might take me a little while. The easiest way to reach me is through text messages. Y'all have a good day. I'll hang around if you have any questions for a few minutes.
Wait, what was the take-home test like again? I don't even remember.
Quiz?
I give you a test and you get like a week to answer all the questions.
Oh,
It was that quiz.
I may do a quiz. I did a quiz last time, didn't I?